Um, but once black soldiers were captured, the Confederacy did not enforce its own laws because they had passed laws saying any black soldier will be considered a slave rebel. And being a slave rebel, that was a pretty serious crime in the South. But no, they treated them as prisoners of war if they were captured alive.
Yeah.
There were some who didn't want to capture them alive. Of course, as you know, they wouldn't exchange them. And Lincoln suspended prisoner of war exchanges when the South would not exchange black soldiers as well as white soldiers. Now, some people say, well, Lincoln had a vested interest in not having prisoner of war exchanges because the North had a manpower advantage, and there's no point in sending men back to the South. You know, the North can come up with more soldiers, which the South can't. But he was under a lot of pressure on that because the families of white Union prisoner of war soldiers in the South were very angry that Lincoln suspended prisoner of war exchange. They said, my brother or son or something is, the South is willing to exchange him. Lincoln won't let it happen because of these black soldiers. So he was under a lot of pressure, but he did not. He suspended prisoner of war exchanges. But I think Lincoln did not want to get into a thing of executing prisoners of war. Now, of course, he understood that the Southern treatment of black soldiers was reprehensible and a violation of whatever rules of war there are, but there wasn't a heck of a lot he could do about it ultimately.
Yeah. I mean, the same thing happened with Fort Pillow and all
Yeah,
these other atrocities.
they investigated Fort Pillow, but there wasn't a heck of a lot they could do about it.
Yeah.
Yeah. The Civil War is full of atrocities, as many wars are. And not only against black soldiers, of course. War is hell, as General Sherman famously said.
EJ, I want to ask you. Oh, go ahead.
Go ahead.
Okay. I was wondering how big of an impact do you feel on Lincoln's ability to grow and expand? Do you feel that his relationship with Frederick Douglass had?
I think Lincoln and Douglas is interesting. Professor Oakes wrote a book about Lincoln and
Yeah.
Frederick Douglass, which is it. Relationship might be a slight exaggeration. They only met twice, really, and then at the second inaugural, Douglas shook his hand, but that was among a big crowd. They had two meetings at the White House, one in 1863, one in 1864. I don't know if that constitutes a relationship or not, but certainly Lincoln knew about Frederick Douglass. Everyone knew about Frederick Douglass. He was a very famous guy at that point, and admired him. And I do think, and I said in my book, that encountering people like Douglass and many others, I started counting up. He met with all sorts of black leaders. He was the first president ever to do that. Martin Delany, Crummell, I mentioned, black church leaders, delegations of black representatives from various places, Sojourner Truth. Lincoln shared some of the prejudices of his era. I don't think there's any doubt about that. But he did not have a kind of visceral racism. It didn't bother him meeting with black people and shaking their hand and sitting down and talking about things. Douglass, who criticized Lincoln many times, said, when I met with him, he just treated me like a man. I didn't feel there was any difference of race between us. We just sat there and talked about politics, And I think Lincoln saw in Douglass, a guy like himself in a way. They were both, in the terminology of that period, self-made men. They had both risen up from very humble, Douglass from slavery, Lincoln from poverty, by their own effort, basically. Nobody helped them. And by their mind, both of them realized, this is the key to Lincoln, the way to get ahead is through your mind. Remember this, folks. That's why you're in school. Lincoln was a big, strong guy, as was Douglas. But Lincoln didn't want to get ahead just by chopping wood his whole life, or working on a farm. He wanted to get ahead intellectually. That was the route to success. They're both self-educated, totally. Lincoln went to school 1 year in his life. Douglas never went to school. They educated themselves, and they realized that's the way to get ahead. And so they're very similar types in a weird sort of way. And I think they understood that, And they both became great orators and thinkers and writers through their own efforts. So I think it did have an effect on Lincoln, meeting a person like Douglas, but many, many others he met also. I counted about 20 different black people he met with in the White House, and no president before Lincoln ever met with any other black person, with one exception. James Madison, I think, met with Paul Cuffey about colonization. This is 50 years earlier. Cuffey was a black seaman, a seafarer, who had a plan for black Americans to go to West Africa. And Madison met with him. That's the only case of a president meeting with a black person. I'm not talking about a slave. There were slaves in the White House. I'm talking about public issues until Lincoln. So that was an important change in how the government operated, really, and I think it shows something about Lincoln. And it did have an effect on his racial views. So I think, unfortunately, I have to go. I have a meeting at 3 o'clock up at school. So pleasure to talk to all of you, and good luck. I know some of you are seniors, so good luck in college next year. If you end up coming to Columbia, drop by.